actually in about 45 minutes.
Hi everyone, I'm live.
Yes.
Uh, okay. Okay. Hold on, everyone. It might be up here stealing Pamela's computer. We're talking about we're talking about science fiction and how it's changed since we started sending missions to planets like Mars. Can they hear me?
They can hear you.
Okay.
On the diagonal, I'm handing her a microphone so you can hear better. This is going
Okay.
to.
Okay.
One is going to stream, the other is going to on the diagonal.
Okay. Let's hope we don't get weird feedback. Pamela will be joining us later after she goes and gets ready for story time, which will be up after this panel. So it will just be me and on the diagonal for probably about the first, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes.
Hello. I'm happy to be here. Excited to talk about sci-fi
Can you hear him?
and science.
What kind of sci-fi do you like to read or watch?
Ah, I have read and watched and listened to so many different kinds of sci-fi. Japanese sci-fi, UK sci-fi, traditional sci-fi, classic sci-fi, recent sci-fi, from space opera to hard sci-fi. A
Give
lot
us
of that
your.
will probably come out during the
Mm-hmm.
conversation.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us like your top five?
Top five. I
Not to
could
put you on the spot.
say Frank Herbert as an author, and not just Dune. I read his
Mm-hmm.
other stuff first. Dune was a long time coming for me to read.
Mm-hmm.
Doctor Who, because of its breadth of exploration over its many, many years of history. Um, Star Trek in various incarnations is a big one.
Mm-hmm.
2001, the movie, not the book, because of
Oh,
what it did.
yeah, it's such a
And
beautiful
if I had to
movie.
say one more, probably Blake Seven, a very different kind of sci-fi.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's been a very long time since I've seen Blake Seven. Blake Seven's delightful. Like, for everyone listening and watching, if you've never seen Blake Seven, just if you can find it, go check it out. There's like really just nothing else like it.
They had their 50th anniversary not too long ago, so they re-released all of the discs in the UK, and they were
Oh,
planning a box set for the US, but they axed that for some reason.
oh, that makes me sad. I really, really love that one. Uh, I think for me, like my all-time favorite, if we're talking TV shows, my all-time favorite sci-fi TV show is Babylon 5. Um,
That is a really good one to choose as well. I love that too. I'm actually listening to a podcast right now where they're rewatching it, so I'm enjoying the show from fresh eyes.
oh, that's the best. I'm excited. I get to show it to some people close to me for the first time soon, so that's gonna be fun. Um, but yeah, another thing that I really love, like, and I think is like pertinent to this panel or this discussion topic, is Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, which was written before we ever sent any missions to Mars, a long time before we sent any missions to Mars. And it's interesting to see like what or to read what he imagined, Mars looking like, and imagined it as this very much like alive planet. I don't know. Have you read The Martian Chronicles on the diagonal?
I have, although I experienced it first as the TV miniseries before I read it.
Okay, cool. How did the book compare?
The book was very different in so
Mm-hmm.
many ways. Very different. It spent a lot more time giving us a sort of behind the scenes look at some of what the Martians were doing, but the TV series, not so much. The TV series focused on the people, and the Martians were sort of surprises when they showed up.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we want to start? Do we want to start with what science fiction was like before Mariner, or do we want to talk about what Mariner was and what it did before we start making comparisons?
Why don't you? I think probably you probably know more about the Mariner mission than I do. I'm unfortunately like not as familiar with that one as I am with other Mars missions. So I don't know if you could give like a quick overview of that for our audience.
I can. And if people are interested enough in it, they did a history of JPL on YouTube, a 6-video series, hour and 20 minutes each. And one of the episodes is on NASA's missions to Mars. It focuses on the Mariner mission. Plus, a lot of the contemporary videos that NASA did, and Mariner 6 and 7 in particular, got big coverage. People can go watch a whole lot more. There's a lot there. But Mariner was a set of 10 missions designed to explore the inner solar system, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. 4 of them were not successful. They had problems at or shortly after launch. The first one that was successful flew by Venus and gave us some information and some photos, and then flew on. And so it didn't give us a whole lot because Venus turned out to be covered with clouds. The next 4 Mariner missions that were successful were all Mars flybys. First one was the first time they really tried to put a camera of any function on a robotic spacecraft, and they had to invent digital photography for it. And it only was able to take 20 images or so, 21, I think, images of Mars. That was a lot of money and a lot of time to wait for those 21 images. And when they came back, they weren't ready to process the digital information. It was coming back at 8 bits per second. It was nail-biting for everyone to wait to see those first images. So they learned from that, and when the next 2 missions went, NASA decided, let's put these on a bigger rocket, which meant they could put a whole lot more instrumentation and a more sophisticated camera on. So they put video cameras on the Mariner 6 and 7. And they got a lot better images. They found out about craters on Mars. They took some measurements of the atmosphere. They thought they might have found water, but they did discover that the polar caps were there. The southern polar cap was mostly frozen carbon dioxide, temperature measurements. And so when Mariner 9 came along, they thought, well, we'll get some more of the same. But then Mariner 9 went by, and it flew by the other side of Mars, not the part that we had seen on the previous missions. And it was the other side of Mars where Olympus Mons was located and Valles Marineris. 2 enormous surprises. We found the biggest volcano in the solar system and a canyon that would stretch from Los Angeles to New York. Mm-hmm. So it, on the one hand, showed us Mars was kind of a dead world. There wasn't a lot of life there. Before then, we had fuzzy images through an earthbound telescope. And we knew there were dark patches and light patches. We knew there was probably a polar cap, but a lot of it was imaginative of what we were trying to interpret what we were seeing. And the close-up images let us know there were craters, which means probably not a thick atmosphere. We got measurements. It's mostly carbon dioxide. It was thin. So there wasn't life there. We were kind of disappointed we didn't see life, and there probably wasn't a chance of life on Mars. But we did find some amazing geology, which did spark some additional imagination in the human spirit.
Yes. And of course, now we know that Mars is at least geologically alive, as evidenced by recent Mars quakes, which is really cool. But yeah, Mars is just, it's really captured the imagination of sci-fi writers. I I mean, later tonight we'll be having story time with, and Pamela will be reading Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars, which all the John Carter of Mars stuff is just wild to read. It's more like space fantasy than sci-fi. So, are you familiar with those stories?
I'm familiar with the first few. I helped to get a uh, digital copy of the first one online so that it would be available for free to people because it's a public domain novel now.
Oh, that's cool.
But yeah, it's probably one of it, along with War of the Worlds, were probably two of the biggest sci-fi influences on our expectations and imagination and thought of what Mars was
Mm-hmm.
for most of the 20th century.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think it kind of built up this very like I guess kind of just very grand picture of what Mars could be, which of course then, the reality has been very very different, but I would argue no less interesting. Because I mean just oh, I'm sorry, my thoughts are falling out of my head.
Well, it is. It's very. It's very much an adventure novel.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, hero in an unusual situation on an alien planet, trying to fight for values, and it's very much an adventure novel in the same vein as things like the Three Musketeers,
Mm-hmm.
adventure novels that were popular in France at the end of the 19th century, and which I would argue laid the foundation for what Jules Verne and film adaptations of Jules Verne did at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of the 20th century to sort of lay one side of the foundation of modern sci-fi as adventure tales. And so we get space opera out of that. Star Trek is
Yes.
the latest, and Star Wars fans might argue, but I would say it's the biggest modern space opera.
It's
But
fighting
we've
words.
had Buck, we've had Buck Rogers, we've had Flash Gordon, we had Planet of the Apes. They're all very
Mm-hmm.
imaginative space opera tales where there are heroes in a difficult situation, making choices, having explorations and adventure, and that's been a part of sci-fi since Jules' novels Around the World in 80 Days,
Mm-hmm.
uh, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his Trip to the Moon, which got made into one of the earliest sci-fi films.
Mm-hmm. Which is still a lot of fun to watch. And I think you can find that on YouTube now.
Yes. But as a result of Verne's uh, books making it to French film, because I think Verne was more amenable to the idea, long before Wells's
Mm-hmm.
books were adapted for film, film owes a lot more to French sci-fi than to British sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about things like Metropolis, where they work to create the book and the movie in concert, that have since become such cornerstones of both the literature and the film industry?
You do get some of that as well. When we hit the 1920s, there was a desire to make artful films. There was still a point where we hadn't hit the Great Depression. There was a lot of money going around, and films were still silent. So you had to make it a really big visual spectacle, something that it has in common with us in the post Star Wars era, and something that was lost for a long time in sci fi.
So, one of the things that I find somewhat heartbreaking, and you may have already hit on this earlier, is we had the greats like Ray Bradbury who wrote so much prior to various spacecraft making it to other worlds, and then really didn't after the realization that other worlds were not as life filled as one would think. And we've seen this major change where we once imagined the races we'd meet, and now we imagine the hazards that will try and kill us.
I
There
Tanya,
wasn't a lot of realization before Mariner how difficult it was.
I think the one thing that sticks out in my mind with regards to that isn't so much like, say, Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles. It's this one story in the Illustrated Man collection, and I'm trying to find the title of it, and it's the one about Venus. And he imagines Venus as this lush, terrifying jungle full of monstrous plants that are pale because they've grown under this cloud cover, and perpetual rains. It's just constantly raining, and it's just it's so evocative. And of course now we know that's like the Venus is nothing
Death
like
World.
that. Yeah. And but it was still like it's almost very much it's a horror story. And so it's still that kind of like seeing Venus as this very like scary, it's a death world.
Yeah.
Like definitely like on the right path with like, you know, I guess like the vibe. But it's just I don't know, there's something about like early 20th century and then like mid-century sci-fi that is just so full of wonder and terror. And you know, of course, with these missions, like with the Mariner missions, we've seen like just this big shift. And it's what you mentioned, that like instead of like imagining like what kind of life we'll find out there, it's like what kind of hazards. And you know, now you see sci-fi like sorry, I always bring this up with The Expanse,
Yeah.
which is dealing more with like the realities of living out in space, like realities that we are going to have to tackle in our near future.
That there wasn't a lot of that in sci-fi before the Mariner mission. There wasn't a lot of investigation of what it would take to put people in space and how difficult and how dangerous. In doing my research, I came across one book that I tried to get before this event so I could have a chance to actually read it, but I haven't. But it was highly recommended. George O. Smith's Venus Equilateral series, which is far more about the technology of, in this case, putting something into the Venus orbit at its L4 Lagrange point and make it a place where we're looking at what it takes to keep humans alive in space, and less about the let's have an adventure and explore and do heroic things.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I'm looking up this the series you mentioned, and it looks really awesome. So I am putting that on my reading list. Thank you.
What is the thing that you most wish that missions and science had found to be true that was dreamed of and then denied us?
I think just meeting I'm meeting aliens. I remember as a kid, like looking at Mars in the sky, this little red dot, and I read the Martian Chronicles. I don't know how many times when I was a kid. I still have my copy that I bought at like with my allowance money when I was like 10. And it's just been read to pieces. And I, you know, of course, by then this was like I'm in my 30s, so this was like the 90s. Like I already knew that like Mars was not as Ray Bradbury envisioned it, but I just couldn't get that image out of my head.
I still
of these
reread it.
Beautiful golden-eyed Martians with that like communicate through song and have these beautiful villas in the desert and stuff. And it's just such a beautiful, beautiful imagery. And I don't know, it would just be really cool to meet people like that, because in the Martian Chronicles, you know, the Martians are very much like they love art and music and it's like art and music and science and technology are just all like intertwined in their culture in a way
Yeah.
that like just really stuck with me. That kind of is very like similar to like my own approach to those things. That it's like all of these things coexist to make to make society more beautiful. And I don't know, like the part of me that just has that like very kind of almost like childlike sense of wonder still, like wishes that like we could have gone to Mars and met people like that.
Yeah. What about you on the
Uh,
diagonal? What do you wish had actually turned out to be true?
I wish that by now we had figured out instantaneous, faster than light communication.
Yes.
Ursula K. Le Guin had the Ansible in her science fiction stories,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding now after Mariner how long it takes to send photos taken at Mars to Earth, I wish we could have that kind of instant communication. That would make space missions so much easier, so much more immediate, and
Mm-hmm.
preserve that excitement. We're at Mars. You can see the pictures now. As I was saying before you joined us, back when Mariner first happened, it took overnight to process the images that were sent to us at 8 bits per second. And it took a week to send back the 20 photos that were taken. I would rather get all of that information right away. That's part of our current age, perhaps. But Ursula K. Le Guin imagined that instantaneous communication when she wrote about alien civilizations contacting us.
Well, it was more than just instantaneous communication. It was instantaneous communication with no bandwidth limitations.
That's the real dream. Endless bandwidth.
Yeah. I want all of it now, please.
There's also kind of an idea like played with in some sci-fi, and I think like the two big examples for me at least are like Babylon 5 and Mass Effect, where like Mars ends up being like the kind of the place where like it, the big story kicks off with like finding ancient alien technology
Yeah.
and finding out that these like aliens that are just so much bigger and so much older than us were like basically in our our like backyard, so to
Yeah.
speak. And just kind of it was kind of like, I guess, reinventing that kind of mystery, that mystique of Mars, for kind of, I guess, like the post mission like
Yeah.
generations, like still kind of keeping that sense of wonder but also giving it kind of a very unsettling edge.
Yeah. I feel like I should know this and I don't, and I'm wondering if one of the two of you does. Was Stranger in a Strange Land by Heinlein before or after the Mars missions?
Oh, it's been
Before.
so, yeah,
It was
okay.
before.
It was before.
Uh,
So here we have someone with The Moon as a Harsh Mistress who over and over and over got the science and the predictions of what was going to be hard and what was going to be easy bang on correct. And then when he looked at Mars, had imagined civilization. There's so many what ifs out there.
Mm-hmm.
Mars has been a sort of a focal point for storytelling since ancient times. Uh, the Babylonians were the first to sort of associate it with war and conflict. The Egyptians associated it with their god Horus, who was key in their pantheon. The Chinese associated it with the element of fire.
Yeah.
And the Greeks and Romans, who in the Western world we get a lot of in school if we get mythology, wrote stories about a deity who was the god of war and had a huge influence on humans. And that kind of mystery and storytelling carried with us until until science.
And this brings up a really amazing point that I hadn't thought of, where there was this time more than 400 years ago when we didn't yet understand that Mars was a sphere you could stand on.
Mm-hmm.
We just knew it was a point of light that moved against the stars.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've had two transitions. One from it being that thing that inspired the idea of fire gods, then to a red marble world that people saw snow caps and folks like Percy Lowell dreamed of canals,
Mm-hmm.
to then seeing a desert world that, well, as we'll talk about tomorrow, we now know has water underneath that dust.
Yeah. It's just, we're always, I don't, it's so neat how like our understanding of Mars is just, it's constantly evolving. It feels like it's been evolving a lot faster in the past like decade or so. And then, you know, to go from like seeing it as like this dead world after Mariner to now knowing that it's geologically alive, and that it, you know, at least we know that at some point in its geological history it had the capability of supporting life as we know it. And it's just that possibility is just, it's so exciting. And it's also, I just love this idea that we are constantly rediscovering this planet.
Mm-hmm. Now, to go back to those even earlier times, one of the things that we struggle with a lot in modern astronomy is explaining to various indigenous peoples the scientific understanding of these various worlds that have very specific cultural meanings to them.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the Navajo will go inside during an eclipse due to their traditions. Now, do you know of any stories where, as our understanding went from the lights that inspired myths of gods of fire to Galileo seeing spheres? How did this affect the storytelling of those cultures? I don't know if any of you know.
I don't know, but now I want to like reach out to people and talk about that, because that's one thing about, you know, scientific discovery is, you know, always like the challenge of reconciling it with our stories, and still making room for our stories and, you know, cultural meanings and beliefs to still have significance while coexisting with science. I mean, just my personal viewpoint on that is that they don't have to contradict each other.
I'm with you.
But it's also, there's still that, you know, tension. And I think that tension can create a lot of like interesting, deeper connections, both with science and with these stories that are important to our respective cultures.
Yeah.
It's also a function of
change? I'm going to get headphones so I can hear you better. I can hear you just in the distance on the diagonal. So please keep talking as I get closer and closer to a source of hearing you more clearly.
I don't know of much sci-fi as sci-fi that's outside of the French and British tradition until fairly recently. Even in the US, we didn't really have sci-fi writing until the 20th century much. And when we did, it was the French model of the adventure story for the most part early on. I can think of Mary Shelley's story Frankenstein, which sort of stands on its own.
It's considered the first sci-fi novel.
The first sci-fi novel, yes. It's not considered the foundation of sci-fi because it didn't sort of establish a genre space the way the multiple works of Wells and Verne did, and probably because it was authored by a woman.
Yeah,
sad to say.
I would argue it did establish a genre tradition, but yeah, I know that is a debate for another night.
It also was a genre straddler. It straddled so many boundaries because it was so imaginative and new and fresh that it was hard for anyone to pin down as one thing or another. Even now, in the sci-fi community, there's a debate as to whether monster movies in their various forms are sci-fi or not. And in some cases, they fit any definition you want to write. But in other situations, well, it borders into horror,
Yeah.
or gothic, or
And I mean,
some other
that's
genre.
very, that's, you see that a lot in, like, you know, postmodern literature and our,
Hmm.
like, what you see in, like, genre fiction currently is just a breakdown of boundaries between genres. And I personally think that it's beautiful, because it's like reading things like Tamsin Weir's Locked Tomb series, which is, yeah, it's like, it's space fantasy, or I've heard people call it science fantasy, and it's about, it's a space opera about necromancers. And it just, like, it obliterates the boundary between sci-fi and fantasy in a way that is weird and wonderful. And I love seeing that. I love seeing authors that are like, well, screw your genre of definitions. I'm going to do what I
And
want.
N.K. Jemisin did that with her trilogy of the first book is called what is it called? The Stone Sky, or is that the third novel? I
Oh,
get the titles confused because
yeah.
they're a little bit generic. But N.K. Jemisin's
The fifth
Moving Earth
season.
trilogy, it
Mm-hmm.
it
No, N.K.
it
Jemison's
works.
amazing.
Yeah.
Mhm. N.K. Jemisin being an African American author who also I discovered originally because she wrote a breakout series of Green Lantern, which is a comic book that I read.
Yes, I love her Green Lantern series. Oh my god.
And
I love Green Lantern, and I love hers especially.
if you haven't read this trilogy, though, I highly recommend it
Mm,
because it won the Hugo
Yeah.
for every single volume of the
Yeah.
trilogy in 3 successive years, and no other sci-fi author has managed that.
And it introduces so many interesting concepts that we just haven't seen, and it looks at ethical questions, it looks at scientific questions, and the interweaving of all of it leaves you heartbroken. Yes, read it.
it
See
is
in
on my list.
chat, the title is the fifth season. Is the
Yeah.
first volume the
Hmm.
fifth season?
I'm now going to go reread it. It's time.
She's an amazing writer. I've been reading some of her short fiction, because it just, you know. Side note, like, every October I try to read, like, one spooky short story a day through Halloween. And I found one of hers, in actually in a collection of horror, edited by Jordan Peele, and it's called Reckless Eyeballing. And yeah, just look it up. It's amazing. Like, just her writing's fantastic, and I really, really love her short fiction. And
Yeah.
now I'm going to go check out this novel as soon as I get a few things off my currently reading pile.
I also read Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy, and to bring this
Oh,
Oh,
back to our topic here, what these authors are doing in our post Mariner is to either A, bring aliens to us
yes.
so that we can experience them, or set something far enough in the future or crossing the boundary into fantasy to explore a sci-fi situation by expanding the world borders, as it were.
Yeah. And that particular series also includes the and the universe is trying to kill you problem. And so we have the ragtag remnants of humanity issue, and yeah, it's go read it. I can't really say anything else without spoiling it. And it opens your minds to entirely new language about life.
Octavia Butler was the best.
Yeah.
The best.
So,
But
go ahead.
But going back to what was asked earlier about stories in other cultures, the one other story I can think of is a centuries old Japanese tale that recently got made into I want to say it was a Miyazaki film that wasn't a Ghibli film, but I'm not sure about that. They created a whole new style of animation for it that looks like Japanese watercolor,
Oh.
called The
Wow.
Princess Kageyusha. And it is a science fiction tale at its heart, but it's also a human tale. The uh, ruler of the moon sends his daughter to live among Japanese peasants, and she lives her life here on Earth. And it's a look at human culture, human interactions. And I won't say anything more, but I recommend watching the movie version because it is visually brilliant, but the ending will leave you with a bit of a heartbreak.
Good things make you feel, and not all feelings are good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay.
And that's the beauty of fiction, is that it can kind of create the safe place to process those feelings that aren't so great.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh God, Parable of the Sower is intense.
Mm-hmm.
I actually, confession, I've never been able to finish Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower because
Same.
it gives me the most intense nightmares, and I've tried to read it like 5 times. Someday I'll finish it because it's a good book. It's worth reading. It's worth kind of struggling through.
Yeah, I was listening to the audiobook of it while walking around in the old part of Montreal, and I ended up at one point just sitting down and staring out at the water being ripped open listening to it.
Yep. That's
Oh.
yeah. Her if you
Yeah.
if you want to just absolutely like destroy yourself emotionally in the best way, read Octavia Butler's work. Just so good.
Now, one of the things that ends up getting struggled with across both eras of science fiction is the alien friend, foe, or simply a reflection of ourselves that is both good and bad in turn? Has there really been an evolution in bias between those before and after, or is it simply a reflection of culturally what's going on in the world? Do either of you have a sense of that?
Oh.
I get the sense that it's a constant potential theme in
Mm-hmm.
throughout science fiction. You have Wells' Martians are cool, dispassionate, and
Yeah.
come here to wipe out humanity and take over the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You have the same thing happening in Quatermass, which is a just pre Doctor Who UK TV series. It was
Okay.
the series that caused the BBC to think we need a special effects department. And it was alien horror. Alien arrives on Earth and begins to look like it's going to wipe out humanity. Then, when we get the communist scare in the 60s and 50s, we get Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yep.
Aliens are here to take over. And we just see that in multiple science fiction things throughout the history of sci-fi. I think it's just one subgenre of sci-fi to phrase a social question. Can humanity survive? What will happen in kind of a situation? And what's the best and worst of humanity that might come out of experiencing that conflict?
Yeah, and then you have stuff like, say, Star Trek, where often alien races are used this as more of like a metaphor for issues that we are struggling with in the real world. I rewatched a classic Trek episode recently. There was A Taste of Armageddon. I love
I
those
don't
old.
remember that one.
I love those old sci-fi titles.
Basic
Yeah,
plot?
It's the one where they come to this planet where these two warring races have come up with a more like humane way of fighting, which is they run computer simulations, and
Yes.
then they tally up the deaths on each side, and then they round up people and send them to these like killing machines. And it's all about the like the depersonalization of
Fixing the audio. I'll be
warfare.
right back.
And again, you have that where it's like it's yeah. I find that like Star Trek does that or especially like older Star Trek tends to do that a lot. It's like the alien race isn't necessarily there to like function as like they're not so much functioning as characters as like just metaphors and kind of a vehicle to like comment on issues that we are experiencing here on Earth. And I don't know. I think that kind of sci-fi can be very interesting because again, it's that whole idea of using fiction to kind of distance ourselves enough from a difficult topic so that we can actually engage with it and process it.
And that was something that was present in sci-fi short stories and a few sci-fi novels before that point. But once we hit the 60s, that's when it crossed over into television.
Yeah.
With Star Trek is the most persistent of those, but also the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits. Those all came out in that window of time where we realized sci-fi storytelling could do so much more.
Yes.
And you really get that, especially during like the Cold War. Like sci-fi got scary.
Yeah.
It got dark, and it was a lot of times functioning as like cautionary tales in much the same way that horror does. And fell out of my head. I've been reading a lot of James Tiptree Jr. lately. If you ever want to read some really creepy stuff.
So we're down to 2 minutes. If people could only read, or let me rephrase the question differently. If people could only ask for one book for their upcoming birthday, because everyone has a birthday, what book would you recommend other than The Fifth Season?
Oh.
That's a real tough one because there are so many. I would probably go with more of a classic, Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama.
Yes.
Yes, that one's good. I would. This one just popped into my head. I would like a print edition of the New English translation of Solaris.
Oh.
Because so Amazon owns the rights, and they've only put out a digital copy of this. It's really annoying. I would love a print copy of it because it was, written. It's originally written in Polish, and previously the only English translation we had was an English translation of a French translation.
It was really dry,
and
it lost a lot.
Yeah, and a few years ago, a guy was like, "Hey, I'm gonna actually translate the original Polish into English," and I'm currently reading a digital copy of that, and it's so good.
Oh,
it's so good. It's not dry and bleh, like the translation of a translation. And I would love a nice print copy of that to hold in my hand and to take places so I don't have to like whip out my iPad anytime I want to read it.
Now, what would you recommend to others?
To others?
Yeah.
Oh.
While she's thinking, I'm mad that there is not an English translation of Stanislav Lem's novel His Master's Voice, which did get made into a Soviet movie, but has no English translation for me to read.
Did Tarkovsky do that one too? Because I love Solaris. Anyway, that's, again, I could probably do a whole panel on Soviet sci-fi. Sorry, recommending to other people. I would recommend Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. It's so much fun, and it's so weird, and it's also very gay.
Book two, be ready to have to read more than once, or only focus on it and nothing else in the universe while you're reading
Yeah,
it.
I still haven't finished book 2.
Like The Witcher, it skips around, and
Yeah.
if you're not paying enough attention, you no longer know when you are.
But just the Locked Tomb series, like the whole series is just, it's wonderful, and just, it's so weird. I've never read anything else like it.
Yeah.
And it's also like, I don't know, it's like, especially if you're like just a weird queer girl nerd like me, it will make you feel very seen in the best ways.
So clearly we're going to have to put together a reading list.
CosmoQuest reading list. We can bring back CosmoQuest book club.
Yes. This is
I think I just volunteered myself for something.
I think we volunteered ourselves together, and we just may try and draft you on the diagonal. So I see that we have Veronica in chat. I think she's sharing her video. I am going to invite Allie to round out this session while I go back to producing. Next up, if you couldn't guess from the onesie, it's story time,
which, as I said earlier, is very topical for what we've been discussing. Get a little pre-Mariner sci-fi weirdness with a princess on Mars in a little bit. But first, we are going to go to Minecraft for a tour. And I just want to say thank you again to On the Diagonal for joining us for this. We really appreciate it.
And we are switching in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone. Hope you've been enjoying our lovely discussion